After the death of a certain CEO, a lot of people were wondering, why could our generation be so supportive of the person who did it? That was a big question on many people's minds because they looked at this and they saw it as objectively bad. And in many ways it is. This is not an analysis of the event itself, but rather the big question, why did it appeal to our generation? And when thinking about this, it really allowed me to understand so many different aspects of who we are and where our American society has come to, where our culture has come to. That it took me from anywhere from Luke Skywalker and Omni-Man all the way to art paintings and the idea of societal trust. So in these series of videos, we're going to look into exactly that. Why did this appeal to Generation Z? So let's look into it. First, as I'll say probably a bunch of times in this series, this is not about the particular event, and this is not a defense or a support or anything like that. Rather, it's an analysis of the environment and the personal factors that have made so much of Gen Z susceptible to being interested in Luigi. Then the next thing I want to talk about is why this will be so different from a lot of the other analysis videos on this topic or similar topics. And that's because rather than it being some complex narrative with evidence and statistics, although I should have some of those, it's not going to be about the particular event or about understanding our society at a deeper level. Rather, it's going to be understanding ourselves and how we got there. It's about understanding who Generation Z is and how we got to the point as an entire generation of being susceptible to this. Why is this an important distinction? Because a lot of really smart people have made great video essays about analyzing how this act, was defeating capitalism, or how it's one more reason why we should protest more, or that politics is dead, or that young people are stupid, or whatever. Like, there's a lot of videos like that, and that have very good points. But again, they take it a little too deeply because your average Gen Zer does not know all the background of this particular event. They don't know the history of United Healthcare and how they treated their patients or treated their providers. They don't know about the history of political acts of oppression, right? They just know what they've been involved with. They know what they feel. And that's what this video is about. And that's what these videos will be about. How we got to the point where we're feeling this way. First, who is Gen Z? Well, let's start very basically. We're not millennials, okay? Millennials were born from 1981 to 1995. And a lot of older people, particularly grandparents and even some people Gen X age, my parents, they get confused by this. They tend to think that anyone coming after them are millennials. But this is a really important thing to start out with because millennials come from very different background and way of thinking than we do as Gen Z. And if we're going to understand why this topic appealed so much to our generation, we'll have to start there. What are the differences? First, starting out, it's not just about personality traits and hairstyles. It's not like our generation is just about the curly haired broccoli look, or millennials are just about skinny jeans. That's not just what it's about. There are some really core fundamental things. And it also goes and it coincides with Luigi actually being the same age as our generation. He actually is Gen Z. I think he was born in 1997 or 1998. So that coincides not just with the actual event, but it coincides with our generation as well. So what's the most important thing we'll have to learn about millennials? Well, they grew up in the self-esteem era. They grew up in an era where trying to make people believe in themselves, love themselves, and especially children, was something that was taking over our culture by storm. And if you've watched any of my videos or you watch any after, you'll see that I talk a lot about Jean Twenge, who wrote several books on generations. She actually wrote one on millennials as well called Generation Me, which talks exactly about this self-esteem issue. But we're going to reference her book Generations, which goes into depth on all of the different generations. And one aspect, one part of the book, she brings up this graph, and I'll put it here. And you can see in the graph that just around the time of millennials, as they were growing up, self-esteem was hitting a record high. It was going up like crazy. This was such a fad at the time that in response to a contrary article by the New York Times, a father wrote in in defense. She says, quoting this man, "I don't think we give children too many trophies. If anything, we might not give them enough. Trophies help boost a child's confidence," wrote one young adult in response to a 2013 New York Times op ed criticizing the practice. The op ed was titled, "Losing is Good for You." Once you receive a trophy, you feel like you can do more. It can build up your confidence and self esteem, argued another. So, as you can see, this concept of self esteem was really important while the millennials grew up. Closing out one of her sections, she says, "In short, as far back as we have measures, and as both teens and young adults, millennials are the most optimistic and self confident generation in history." This is in huge contrast to Generation Z. It's amazing the difference that 10 to 15 years can make, because in that time, our technology and our culture progressed in big ways. For one, we grew up and some of our first memories were of the 2008 financial recession that hit our families very hard and hit our entire country and the world very hard. And so while they were growing up with self-esteem and participation trophies and self-belief and self-love, some of our first memories were of the 2008 financial recession. But more than that, from there, Gene Twing and Jonathan Haidt both talk about how social media and smartphones became a big thing in around 2012. So just 4 years later, while the oldest of Gen Z are around 18, 15, 16, they're in that teenage range. What's happening? Well, social media becomes a big element of our lives, along with smartphones. And as Jonah Berger talks about in his book on how ideas go viral, he talks about how it's the arousing emotions that make your body upset, that make you want to do something, right? Those are the things that go viral. It's the things that make you disgusted. Okay, those are the things that turn you on, but also the things that make you angry. And so we see, along with social media and smartphones, all of these toxic negative emotions start spreading more and more and more. But more than even that, we see the rise of internalizing disorders I've talked about in other videos, which is how around 2012 there was a big uptick in things like depression, anxiety, and Jonathan Haidt and Gene Twenge both target social media and smartphones as being the main cause, because rather than socializing with our friends, rather than hanging out in parties and groups and challenging ourselves and having lots of connections and face-to-face interaction, instead we are behind a screen. So there's this increase in loneliness that you feel alongside of that we grew up around the same time. So that's why it's so important to start first with millennials, because we see that 10 to 15 year gap was a huge difference both in optimism but also a huge difference in anxiety and depression and a lot of the insecurities that we feel. Along with this trend comes another big one, and that is the decrease in societal trust, in social trust. What does that mean first before we go into it? Well, it means how much do you trust the news media? How much do you trust universities? How much do you trust professors? How much do you even trust your neighbor? How much do you trust a stranger that you haven't met? That's the concept of societal or social trust. And this, particularly among institutions, has really gone down, starting first with our parents' generation, Generation X. That's something, once again, that Jean Twenge talks about in her book and the chapter on Generation X, how that's where a decrease, a kind of cynicism started, or at least really took hold. Now, you can argue that it took hold somewhat with the boomers and the anti-institutionalism, the hippie movement, right? And that very well could be the case. However, you'd see it most pronouncedly first with Generation X. And from there, it looks like in a lot of ways that our generation has continued that trend all the way to the lowest it has been in a long time. In 1979, almost 50% said they had a great deal of trust in American institutions. And now that number is all the way down, almost halved, down to 27%. And I'm going to put all of my notes and the resources for this down in the comments below. But you can see almost just from that in 1979, which again, by the way, is about when Generation X started really being respondents in this. So as that started, so came a huge decline, almost by half. The Gallup and Walton Family Foundation then more in the present, surveyed our generation, Gen Z, and among the Gen Z respondents, they found that fully 50% said that they had little to no trust in Congress. 46% said they had little to no trust in the presidency, and fully 38% said they had little to no trust in the Supreme Court. And those are just a couple off the top, but a lot of other ones also appeared in similar surveys being low. And it's crazy when you see that compared to 1979, right? What was that? It was 50%. So half had a great deal. And you look at our generation and things like Congress, which in many ways should be not a bastion of politics, which is understandable, but it shouldn't just be that. Congress was made to represent the people. It was made that we as the people, that voters, are the ones electing them, that we're the ones choosing them. So we should have more trust in Congress because they should be the people's voice. That's the whole idea of having your representative in Congress, that they're going to represent your interest. And yet, Gen Z, on the exact institution that you should predict for us to have the highest amount of trust, have some of the lowest ever recorded. And what's even more fascinating is that the ones that played the best, the ones that we had the most trust in, were things like science and the medical system. It seemed like Gen Z had the most trust in those two out of the other ones. And we're going to come back to that later. That's really important to remember, that we seem to have the most trust in science and the medical system. And there's this really good Substack that I'm going to have to look down to read off the full name. A little bit of a wordy name, but it goes into exactly the kind of trust that you have with a stranger or a neighbor. Not necessarily the big institutional trust, but that kind of trust. It's called why you should just about always trust your neighbors. Maple Street, the decline in bridging social capital, and why strangers aren't the real danger, by Griffin. I'm gonna say Gooch. I'm guessing Gooch, but this, despite the wordy title, it really is excellent, and with such a big topic, a relatively small article about how really there is this decline overall in how much we trust our neighbors and how this really hurts our communities and it hurts our lives because most people are exactly that, people. They're people just like you and me. And when we have this instant distrust because of constantly seeing negative messages, negative news headlines on and on, it hurts and makes us feel more isolated and alone. But to sum up what he says, he writes, if actually he quotes the social scientist Jamil Zaki, and he says, if trust was money, its plunge would match the stock market's fall during the Great Recession, which to me was a great quote that summed up exactly what we're dealing with as a generation. The question then is, what are the benefits of a higher trust society? Why does it even matter if we don't trust our neighbor or we don't trust an institution or whatever? Well, then we're missing some really important benefits. Like, for instance, the idea of social cohesion, right? That sounds like a big word, but all it means is that you function well in your community, that you can go outside, talk to someone, and they're going to help you. And that concept, that relationship is then reciprocated with others. They help another person and on and on. Like, that changes an entire dynamic when you have that. When you don't, like I said before, people feel isolated and alone. But more than that, it also is about democratic functioning, right? That, like, again, we talked about, you should be able to trust that your representative is going to represent you properly. And that allows you to then care more instead of this apathetic detachment that so much of our generation is dealing with. And when you look at the negatives, okay, aside from just well-being, which I think is really important, it really increases your well-being when you feel like you can trust people. Like that should not be a surprise to anyone. That feeling like you can trust someone and that you're not surrounded by a bunch of murderous thugs at all times, that actually helps you. It makes you feel better, right? That should be pretty obvious. But when you look at the negatives, it ends up reading almost like a description of the life we live now, of the culture that we live in now. Things like economic challenges, like not knowing where your next job's going to be, or if your employer is going to lay you off because you don't really trust them. With normal transactions, you go to a store and you're wondering if someone's going to con you, if someone's going to commit a fraud, right? You don't realize how much trust is baked into so many normal interactions that you have in an economy, in selling something, in buying something from someone, or just having a an agreement, having a contract, and believing that it's actually going to be fulfilled. Not just economics and isolation, but it also leads to a mental health impact. When you can't trust anyone, right? How much can you really trust yourself? You end up second guessing yourself because when we think about this, we have a little bit of an artificial distinction between self and others. But it's not quite that simple. You can't do that much literally by yourself. If you're locked in a room, how much are you going to be able to do? In order for you to do things, you have to interact with the world. What's the world made of? People. So if you can't trust the people outside, if you can't trust, go on your phone and trust that uh, that your lift is going to come, or that they're not going to hurt you, right? If you can't trust that, then how much can you do? How much do you feel like you can be effective in the world, that you can accomplish something, that you're safe, that you're secure, right? All of these things become in question when you don't trust the people around you and the world around you. And that's one of the huge negative effects, not just economics and democracy, which are very important, but also the mental impact, the mental health impact of not being able to trust. So, in this environment of low trust, like we were talking about, of feeling insecure, like we talked about earlier, now I want to introduce one other element. A lot of anthropologists, psychologists talk about something that's very interesting, particularly John Archer's research looks into this, and that is that unequal or inequitable wealth distribution. You have billionaires who have tons of money, and then lots of people who have very little money. In those types of societies, where there's also low mate choice for young men, where it's harder for them to have a date, to find a long-term relationship. What happens? Well, actually, he looks at these societies over the course of many years, and he sees that in those time periods where those two things are true, violence tends to go up quite a bit. There tends to be a lot more violence and um, social disruption because of these factors. One quote by him that I think sums it up pretty well is he says, "The research evidence highlights that societal issues, such as inequality of wealth and competition between males, may contribute to the violence we see in today's society." I love that. I love that as a quote because it sums up his idea. But this is also something that other anthropologists have looked at in the past and in other societies as well. That once again, when there's a big unequal distribution between people at the top and people at the bottom, and then it's harder for young men to find someone to settle down with, to have a long-term relationship, or even feel like they have that option, that they have that ability, that violence often goes up. So then, based on this, where is Gen Z's natural habitat? Where are we looking for romantic partners to date, etc.? Well, actually, and this is going to come as no surprise, that the places people look and find future romantic partners has totally changed in the past 20 years or so. And I found a really good graph to kind of sum that up. But when you look at it, all of a sudden, at around, I want to say it was early 2000s, but it could have been even before that. And I'm going to put up the graph because I don't have it up in front of me. But you can see that the rate of online dating has shot up astronomically to the point where we're looking that I believe it was almost 50% of Gen Z couples are meeting online. So how does this relate to what we were talking about before with Professor John Archer's ideas of unequal distribution of wealth while at the same time mate competition and not being able to find someone? How does that have anything to do with each other? Well, the question, like I said earlier, is where are we meeting people? And if we're meeting people online, then we should be looking at who is online. How are people meeting? How easy is it? And what's the distribution between people? Well, the top one, to no surprise for our Gen Zers and probably millennials too, is that Tinder is by far number one. And furthermore, they boast that fully 50% of their user base is between ages of 18 20 to 25. Now, I don't remember the date, but I know that was at least 5 years ago. So now it's going to be more our age, but they were fully Gen Zers. So why is this important? Well, if you look at the statistics, the ratio between men and women on Tinder is about 76% to around 24%. So exactly what Professor Archer is talking about is happening in the biggest platform by far for how we today are meeting um, future future partners. The exact platform that's number one has the exact distribution that would increase the levels of violence, or the violence that you would expect based upon his research. More than this, though, it's not just Tinder, which is very important, but also when you look at things like the General Social Survey, which is considered in many people like the holy grail of generational research, when you look at that, well, what do you see? You see that fully 1 out of 3 men ages below 30 had not had sex in the past year. 1 out of 3 in a full calendar year. So that shows that it's not just something on Tinder alone. Like, maybe that's just its own sample size. Maybe that's just kind of weird. It's on its own little island. No, actually, when you look at big pieces of data like the General Social Survey, you see the same type of thing. So what does this lead to? If what he's saying is really true, shouldn't we see an uptick in violence when we look at the statistics? Well, actually, no, we don't. That's the fascinating part. We don't see this uptick. So wait, is what he's saying wrong? Well, no. Here's what I'll argue. I'll argue it's rather a very different phenomenon because Gen Z is meeting people online, not in the real world. The way that we're going to be handling that, the way that we're going to be conceptualizing, feeling like we're rejected or not interested in, one thing I left out was that a lot of studies show that the top 5 to 10% of men in attractiveness are the ones that get by far the amount of interest. So even though there's this giant disparity of men to women, it's even worse than that, at least on Tinder. So why? Back to what we were talking about before. Why is that so interesting? Why is that so important? Well, rather than us acting out, rather than young men who are having this trouble and going through these experiences, rather than them acting out, what might be happening? Is his research just completely wrong? Well, no, I will argue the exact opposite. I think we're taking this inside. That's part of the reason with this rise of internalizing disorders, this rise of things like depression and anxiety, and all these inward focused trouble. Because historically, if you look back to how men and women react, to how more masculine people, more feminine people react as far as psychology goes, when they're struggling with something, someone who's more on the masculine side are going to act out. They're going to do externalizing behavior. They're going to hurt someone or commit violence, threaten violence, get angry, right? A lot of these things are acting outward in the world. Versus someone who's more on the feminine side, they tend to take it more inwardly. They tend to focus more on themselves and how they're feeling and how it sucks, and anxiety and depression, it's all inward focused, right? And that's where you see things like um, self harm, right? That's a big one, self harm. So why? What does this have anything to do with? Well, I think that we're taking a lot of this energy that might have been focused in the past out out into the world, and we're taking that and focusing more inside. Because what is a smartphone really? Well, in a lot of ways, it's this personal portal into the online world. It's this personal portal. And in that portal, we're then taking out this energy, okay? And it becomes this inward internalizing process because rather than it seeming like we're, going out and doing unspeakable things on a street or something. Rather, we're saying terrible things online or following people that we probably shouldn't, or even just finding other avenues online to take this and to take this negative energy. And so it ends up manifesting like an internalizing behavior, like something dedicated inward because of that personal experience of you and your smartphone, or you on your computer, or you and your video games. It's all this inward, individualistic, just one person isolated phenomenon. So while things like violence and alcoholism, things about acting outward are going down, what's also happening? Well, things like video game addiction and porn addiction, they're going up. So the exact externalizing things are going down while the internalizing things are going up. We're taking this frustration that our society and where we're at in this modern life, or this environment, this cultural environment we're in, and we're taking that and putting that into the online world. We're putting that into our phones and computers and video games and pornography, and that's where we're turning it into instead of turning it into that word, which in many ways is probably a good thing overall. But yet, it helps this concept helps us understand why we're feeling the way that we do, and why that as a generation we're so ready to be interested, or to in some cases be supportive of what happened in this United Healthcare incident. What happened to that CEO, and the person who did it? Why we would be interested in that? Because we've been put in a place where we have such low trust, where we didn't grow up with self-esteem. We grew up with the financial crisis, and we grew up with the start of these internalizing disorders, while also feeling like we're not going to be able to find someone, that we might not be able to find someone who's going to truly love us for us, and we don't trust that, you know, our neighbors might be able to help us, or strangers, or that anyone's really on our side, and we don't feel like we can trust institutions, and we don't feel like all these things. And then remember what I told you to remember before. Well, what are the things that our generation often um, esteems the highest, that we put the most trust in, that we think about and actually take care of the most? Well, it's things like science and healthcare. And what is an insurance company, and what were they accused of in this case? Well, they were accused of hurting, and this is all an accusation, but this is how people are perceiving it. So that's the important part. This is about perception. And people have perceived that this incident was against someone who was corrupting healthcare and science. That this institution that our generation distrusts was corrupting healthcare and science, some of the things that we trust the most. And so, in many ways, when you look at this, you see all of the breadcrumbs of the issues that we have with our life, the issues that we have with our culture and with our social environment. So that was a look into how our social environment, how our society has poised Gen Z to be more supportive of something that many people consider to be totally beyond the pale. In the next video, we're going to look into how the personal values of Gen Z and what we're personally inwardly struggling with has made us more susceptible to being interested in this and supportive. In this one, I want to talk more about our personal reasons. Why, from individual to individual, this could be so alluring, that this story could have been so captivating. The first thing I want to talk about is an old meme, and that is the adulting meme. Now, the adulting meme has been basically around since millennials came of age. And it's like, oh, look at me, I'm doing something that's hard. I'm doing something that makes me grown up, or this is so hard to do this. It's so hard to do this normal activity. And at this point, it's become a little overdone and cringe. But why is it important to start there? Well, I think it begins this kind of evolution that that generations have gone through in modern life. And what is that evolution I'm talking about? Well, it's that the modern world, the internet, the demands that we have on us as adults make us feel like it's more difficult than it seems to be. What do I mean by that? Well, there are so many different loopholes and strictures and rules and laws and regulations and this or that that we don't really think of when we're kids. When we're kids, we don't think that we're going to need to register our car with the DMV and we're going to have to renew that yearly, right? We don't think about that. We don't think about having renter's insurance. We don't think about our health insurance, for instance, which is one I'll talk about a little bit later. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about all of these different facets of modern life, are things that we aren't necessarily prepared for as adults. And that's something that's fundamentally unique about our modern world. Our modern world has so many of these little things, these little mandates, we'll call them, or in order for you to do one thing, you have to do another. In order for you to buy a house, you have to have a credit score. In order for you to have an apartment, you have to have renter's insurance, and on and on and on. We don't think about those things. We haven't been taught those things. So there is this feeling among particularly Gen Z, now that we're the young adults on the scene, that we're just unprepared for being an adult. We're just not ready for this stuff. Like, it just seems so random, and it's hard to understand. And oftentimes it's more difficult than it needs to be. And that brings us to something like health insurance. As someone who works in the medical field, seeing people interact, and whether that be doctors and nurses or just normal patients, seeing them interact with healthcare and with health insurance is so fascinating. Now, why is that fascinating? Because this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about when it comes to this adulting evolution, this adulting influence. What am I saying? Well, this level of complexity, this sheer level of complication that you have to go through to understand what it is to have this health insurance. You have the HMO plans and the PPO plans and Blue Cross Blue Shield and United Healthcare, and this is covered, but this is out of network. It is a mind-bogglingly crazy maze to go through to try to understand what these things are. In particular, I remember there was this one patient I was dealing with, and they came in, and I'm afraid they couldn't afford the medication that they were put on. So we had to help them fill out some forms to get some patient assistance because they couldn't afford it. It wasn't going to be properly filled. And so they had to go through these forms to submit it to their companies, right? Well, they go through this form and they do this, and this is before I had met them, and it comes back and it's denied. So I then meet up with them and sit down, and I see that their left eye is swollen, and there's a little bit of, looks like dried pus, and and you can tell they cannot see through it. I mean, there's not even a slit of eye left that they could peer through, and it's just incredibly inflamed, discolored. I can go on and on, but I'll try to keep it. I'll try to keep it as less disgusting as possible. But it was just a sight to behold, and something that would make you very, very sad to think about. And I couldn't even imagine being them. But I see them first with this eye. Turns out they have eye cancer. And part of the reason, and I believe part of the reason why they couldn't afford this, was because they were out of work because of their eye cancer. And they were getting this actively treated, they were going to chemotherapy, and this was this long struggle. Well, I sit down with them to fill this stuff out. We fill it out together. They take their part home so that way they can add some more documents. Well, they come back, bring it back, and we submit it to the company once more. Well, then again, the form comes back to us saying it will not be approved. And this time, why won't it be approved? It wasn't because we missed information. It wasn't because she couldn't see, because she was still peering out of the one eye, right? And then she just missed some random thing. She didn't put an initial there or date this right thing. No, it wasn't even that. It was that the type of form was out of date. They had a new form on their website, and this form was dated 2024, and the last form that we were using was 2023. There wasn't any issue. All that was different was that there was a little bit more writing, and then there were more pages. That was about all. But the entire thing was rejected again. So I had to get on the line with this poor patient with their swollen, cancer-ridden eye and ask them to come back in to submit it once more and submit on their approved documentation, the one that was within that year. And that to me is a great example, one more story of how feeling like an adult, being an adult, and looking at this system, at all of the things that we have to deal with and what's coming up. It might seem on paper that, oh wow, this is so much easier. It's so much easier than the past. We got phones, and if you need to go somewhere, you just order yourself a Lyft or an Uber, right? This is so easy. And in many ways, that's true. That's actually right. It is easier. What's different though is that it just feels like there's this corporate wolf around every corner just waiting for us and saying, oh, you did this wrong. You did that wrong. Oh, you didn't put your initials here. Or, oh, you might have renter's insurance now, but because you didn't have it retroactively for the past, sorry, you can't, you're not eligible, right? It just always seems like there's this little loophole, this little problem that's going to sneak up on us as a generation, as a young adult. And that's part of the reason why we feel this sensation of being overwhelmed, this sensation of feeling like we're insecure. And not, and when I say insecure, I don't just mean like from a personality standpoint, like we've got anxiety or depression or something. What I mean is we feel like we're insecure with our livelihoods, with our money, with our future, with what we can depend upon, that we can feel, that we can tangibly feel, like we could have a house, like we can have someone that we love, like those things won't just disappear on us tomorrow because we decided we weren't going to put our initials in this one area, or we just totally forgot it, we didn't see it, it was tucked in small print. All of this coupled with one more thing that Jean Twenge talks about in her writing. She talks about the slow life strategy, something I've talked about in other videos too. And how this applies here is that as a generation, so many of our milestones that might have given us confidence, that might have made us feel more secure as people, we didn't have a lot of those challenges, those milestones until later in life. So while people of past generations were going out and getting their licenses immediately, they were illegally, right? Something that they probably shouldn't have done, but they were out drinking and partying with their friends. We didn't have so many of those interactions. The ages of us drinking and having those first experiences has gone steadily up over time. And so without those, we again have this sensation of feeling unprepared. That we're unprepared for the future, unprepared for what life might bring us, unprepared for what might randomly spring on us around the corner, that our jobs might change, or that we're laid off because of AI. And technology is another great point, because on top of that, so much has changed with technology. There are so many more opportunities now, but also so many changes, making us feel, once again, unsteady. This even happens in relationships too. In her book iGen, she talks about how some of Gen Z are afraid to catch feelings, and we're more likely to have things like situationships and friends with benefits. And I think a big part of why this is the case, because when you look at surveys, a lot of the surveys still tend to say the same thing, that as a generation we want to have a family, that we want to have a long-term relationship, and yet how does that square with more situationships? How does that square with more friends with benefits? Well, to me, it's this feeling of not being ready. I'm not ready for a long-term relationship. I'm not ready to have a family. I'm not ready for these things, and that's the feeling, the cultural feeling that I think so many of us are dealing with, this feeling of not being ready. On top of this, there's been this really well reported rise in internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression that I've talked about a lot on this channel, and a lot of people talk about Generation Z mention as well. And so, along with this feeling of being unprepared, is this background anxiety. But then, further, how does his story in particular, and we know who the he is that we're talking about, how does his story influence this? How does that story mirror what we're talking about? Well, along with this comes how he was dealing with spondylolisthesis, I believe it is, and I could be getting the pronunciation wrong, but it's this severe neurological problem with his back, which forced him to have to deal with the medical system. And this is all from a cursory Google search. So because I'm not trying to go deep here, I want to see how on the surface Gen Z could be so on board, that we could be so supportive. So that is just all on the surface. You can see just in that little blurb, that one sentence, you can see how that would end up with you dealing with the medical system, with you having to struggle back and forth with that. But furthermore, he then dropped off the map for a while, and that I think echoes a lot of those kind of YouTube rabbit holes, those dark moments that we have where we do the monk mode that has become such a meme, but talks about and highlights a certain underlying truth that a lot of times with our generation, when we're dealing with something, we go inside of ourselves, that we become recluses, that we become more and more isolated. And he was dealing with that as well. But furthermore, that neurological problem affected his dating life, making it so that way he was unable to perform in the bedroom. And that to me is one more echo of some things that we feel like we're dealing with, this kind of background anxiety that we won't quite measure up, and that we won't be able to have those relationships we want to have. It's like this magnified version of so many of the fears that we have as a generation, of so many of the trouble that we think or we wonder if we might have to deal with. Then, on top of this, I want to talk about something a little bit different, but we'll understand why it's so important. And that is the concept of attractiveness and the halo effect. This is something that Daniel Kahneman and Staversky has talked about in their work in behavioral economics, but also in Daniel Kahneman's book Thinking Fast and Slow. He talks about how the halo effect is when someone who's quite attractive is assumed to be good on many other things, is assumed to be more reasonable, smarter. Just you name the thing, they tend to be seen as more of these positive traits. Now, more than this, and although this is true of him for sure, and a big part of the appeal. One more thing, though, along with this, is that one aspect of attractiveness that's very important, actually, is called averageness. Now, when you look this up and do research on this concept, you'll find that people with more average faces, or faces that tend to resemble the most amount of people in that ethnic group. So if you have a black guy who looks a lot like other black guys, they tend to be seen a lot more attractively as someone who has very unique features. People with very unique features usually tend to be seen as people who are ugly or unattractive. But the more average your face is, and I don't mean average in that like, oh, he's a 5 out of 10. No, I mean average in that they look the most like all of the rest of the people of that ethnic group. So I think another good example is Tom Holland. They actually did this research. I'm pretty sure they did some studies on his face, and they saw that he was a great example of this phenomenon. That his face tends to resemble a lot of young white guys, and that's part of the reason why people consider him to be quite attractive. So why is that? Why is that an important point? Because if someone's really attractive, a big part of it is going to be the averageness. But more than just that averageness also stands for something bigger. It stands for, like we were talking about earlier, his story. And we know who the he we're talking about is. His story really tends to look like a magnified version of what we're all dealing with. Like that averageness has made us identify with a lot of the same struggles. And again, I'm not defending anything that was done. I'm trying to understand why that happened to our generation. And that averageness really made us more likely to see ourselves in those experiences, to see ourselves in that same fundamental issue. And what is that? Well, that is at the core of so much of who we are as Gen Z, is this fundamental fear. This fear that we will not be secure enough, that we will not be foundationally ready or good enough for the future. This insecurity that we won't have enough money for whatever happens next, that we won't have enough knowledge, resources, that we won't have the relationship that we want, that we are just not going to be able to have something firm, foundational, and secure. And he represents that in so many ways. He represents how someone who could be doing the right thing, who could get a master's degree in computer engineering, I believe it was, who can go to college to become valedictorian, come from a really good family, could still go down the same hole, could still have the same issues, could still have some random thing happen to them, and that totally change them for the worse, totally impact their life in a terrible way. And then moreover, we then are likely to see how that could lead to so much frustration you could act out in a negative way. Now, again, we're understanding how that could be the case, but I am not in no way justifying it. But we might look at that and we can see ourselves in how that could happen to us. How we might be able to go down a dark road. How we could end up doing something that we might regret because of similar difficulties, because of similar fundamental fears. And while none of that is okay, that I think that is a big part of the reason why so much of Gen Z has seen themselves in this new story, has seen themselves in this event. So that was a look into how Generation Z has personally struggled with some core fears, some core issues, and why that led us down the road, at least some of us, to supporting the person we're talking about here. So in the next video, we're going to talk about from a more artistic, narrative, cultural standpoint, why was this so appealing? Let me say before I get into this particular video that it's going to be a little bit of a journey from topic to topic, but it's going to make sense all the way at the end. So stick with me because I think you'll really understand why this is so important. Our video today begins with a painting by Francis Goya. I'm going to put it on the screen now. I'm going to read a little bit of an excerpt from an article by thearchaeologist.org that will help to explain what this is. But once again, stay with me. This will really become interesting as we go along. The article reads, Saturn Devouring His Son by Francis Goya is a harrowing depiction of the ancient myth of the Titan Cronus, who is Saturn in Roman mythology, who, out of fear of being overthrown by one of his children, devours each child upon birth. So now let's talk about the mythology behind this and why this is so important. It shows the ancient Titan, Cronus, devouring his children. This Kronos we're talking about was actually the youngest of the Titans that came before the Greek mythological characters we know, like Zeus and Apollo and people like that. So he came before them. And there was a prophecy by his mother that said that he was going to have a child that would rise up and overthrow him, just like he had done to his father. So rather than letting this happen, he decided as they were born to eat them one by one. Eventually this got to the point where his wife Rhea, desperate to actually have a child, decided to disguise a child as some rocks and have him eat rocks instead. And so Zeus was able to escape, maturing and growing out of his father's reach. And he rose up one day to then wage war on the Titans. And eventually we know that they rose up to be the gods of Olympus and beat the Titans. But it all comes to that fundamental story. So let me boil it down a little bit more and say it one more time so it makes a little more sense. Basically, Kronos decided to have kids, but before that, he was given this prophecy that they were going to overthrow him. So rather than having that, he decided to eat them. But Zeus escaped and then eventually waged war, making the prophecy come to fruition. So be that the case, why is this so important, or why is this so interesting? Well, this is like the root, or this is one origin of a theme we've seen all over pop culture that we see constantly. And that is this idea of the parents, the evil parents, deciding to eat, mooch off of, leech off of, oppress their children. That they're these evil, corrupt parents who decide to take their children. And I think a great example of this is Mother Gothel. Mother Gothel is on this quest to stay young. And so what does she do? Not only does she lock up Rapunzel in her tower, right? But she also decides that she's going to drain her power to keep her young. That is just one more echo of this same theme. But you can see it with Darth Vader and Luke, for instance. he actually a very similar prophecy. There's going to be bring balance to the Force. Now we thought that was going to be Anakin, and eventually it does become Anakin. But how that was done was that rather than Darth Vader finding out that Padme had kids, they decided to hide them, just like the Titan Kronos. Rather than him knowing, Rhea decided to hide his kid Zeus, and so Luke was hidden as well. It's the same type of echo, and you see this concept of these evil parents oppressing their children, not wanting their children to grow up or to have their own ideas, their own mindsets. You see this in things like Invincible and Omni-Man, where they literally in the last episode have a giant climactic battle between the two of them, fighting back and forth because he just refuses to allow his father to decide for him, to decide who he's going to be and what kind of person he's going to be, which echoes this exact same thing, this exact concept of the corrupt father trying to use, oppress, and take away the freedom of the child. There are darker versions of this too, where, for instance, in Game of Thrones, we see a very similar element with Tywin being ashamed of his son Tyrion, despite them having so many similarities. And we both know how that ends too, for those of us who watched. So then, on top of that, we have the Marvel Universe, which to me, it has so many examples of this. I think Ego versus Star-Lord, though. But we could also take Thanos versus Nebula, for instance, where literally Thanos decides to take Nebula apart, literally ripping her skin off. We think that Kronos is so crazy, but when you think about what Thanos did to Nebula, it's almost worse because he's taking bit by bit parts of her out and substituting them for parts that he prefers, that he likes better, that he thinks will serve his ends better. And it's that same element that we see. But I think Ego versus Star-Lord is the best version of this, that almost maps on in a lot of ways. So the basic story, for those of us who don't remember or who need a refresher, was that Ego, this giant celestial planet, this god, decides he needs to go out and find someone who's going to be compatible with him to carry on his lineage so he can take over, literally spread all over the universe. So he goes one by one through all of these different women, all of these different species, and none of them work. And so what happens? Well, one by one, he kills them. One by one, he kills them until he can find the one that will help him take over the universe. And so when he finally finds Star-Lord, he thinks he's found it, but then he rebels. And what happens? Once again, he tries to kill him. He tries to murder him. And so what, in all of these things, what is the takeaway? What ends up being the core outcome? Well, the child ends up rebelling against the father, ends up rebelling against the parent, ends up asserting their own freedom, and oftentimes it ends with the death, whether that be intentional or unintentional. It ends with the death of the parent, and with the child coming into their own, which leads us to the next important part, which are coming-of-age stories. This has a huge overlap with this idea of the corrupt father and having to assert your own freedom and your own rights. Because a big part of becoming an adult is that freedom, that choice, the fundamental ability you have to exert your own will. But in a world like these ones we're talking about, where the father is powerful and won't let you, then sometimes that ends up with the rebellion ending in their death. And in the case of Luke, he decides not to. But again, that same power that ends up being behind Darth Vader, the Emperor in this case, what happens? Well, he dies as a result of his own corruption, his own power that he allied himself with, that being the Emperor in this case. Then we see a lot of other ones, like for instance, Ego versus Star-Lord, where in order for them to assert themselves, in order for them to do the right thing, and to make the choice that they believe in, they have to full-on kill the father. They have to destroy the father. And that is echoed in a lot of other stories. So that's where we see this overlap with coming-of-age stories, because it's about asserting your independence, asserting your ability to be a person, to have your own views, your own mindsets when it comes to the world and who you're going to be. In an article on literary theory, EnglishStudies.net defines a coming-of-age story as a genre in literature and film that focuses on the psychological and moral growth of a protagonist as they navigate the challenges and experiences of transitioning from adolescence to adulthood. So basically, these coming-of-age stories focus on a teenager full-on becoming an adult. And there's a huge key to this, and that is the loss of innocence, the loss of naivety. When you read an article like that, or you watch videos about coming-of-age stories, that's one of the huge keys, this loss of naivety, this loss of innocence, that you thought the world was this one way, this idealistic way, that it was just like your parents said, or just like the media had said, or just like stories, just like fairy tales, just like whatever the starting point of the film is. And then you learn that no, it's much darker than that, or more gray. That there's much more to it than you had thought before. That is a huge point of a coming of age story. So let's take some examples from what we talked about earlier. A great one, for instance, is Omni-Man versus Invincible. That's a great one. Why? Because Invincible, in the last episode, he learns who his father really is. To the past, he had thought of himself like, oh, he is the son of this Superman-esque figure, this great person, this Captain America, but for the entire world. And then he learns the truth of who he really is and who he really represents, more importantly. And that totally changes him. And you can see the way that he's shattered based upon that. And that's what a lot of coming of age stories deal with. They deal with the broken pieces, the broken parts that you have to reassemble to make yourself an adult. Because your old world is shattered like a piece of glass, like a stained glass window. And you have to make a new picture based upon that. You have to make up your new reality and who you're going to be based upon your new information. That the world wasn't as clear, what it wasn't as perfect, wasn't as ideal as it used to be. Another great example is Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. Again, what's one of the best twists in all of movie history is Episode 5, where it turns out Darth Vader is his father. Why is that so important? Why is that so impactful? Because before he had thought of his father as being this great Jedi Knight, this Jedi Master that he wanted to aspire to be, very similarly to Invincible as well, where then you learn who he truly is. You learn that really your father is not who you thought it was. That the people that you would idolize, the world that you thought you lived in, it wasn't what it used to be. It's something different now. And of course, we have the one we were talking about in more detail, Star-Lord, where he learns that Ego was the one who in fact gave his mother cancer to begin with. And so that was another huge revelation that took away this idea of who his father might be, of who he really had. And by the end of the story, despite him being, in his 30s, and we'll talk about this in a second, but despite him being in his 30s, it turns out to be a really interesting coming of age story, because then from those broken pieces, he realizes that his father might not have been as idealistic, as perfect as he would have preferred him being, this great, literally a god. But Yandu turns out to be so much of his father that he didn't realize that he had, that he didn't conceptualize that he had to begin with, which is a perfect encapsulation of what we're talking about here. That you have this idealistic reality and then it's shattered, this loss of innocence, and you have to rethink your world from then on. And one more little fact will kind of bring this home, bring to a point, and we'll talk about how this all wraps up together. And that is the slow life strategy, which we've talked about on this channel more than once. But why is that important? Because so many of us, we might not think of ourselves like teenagers or adolescents or young people anymore. We might think that we're adults, but our lives have been elongated. Now, rather than going through many of the milestones that someone would have gone through the teenagers, now a lot of that's happening later and later. Now a lot of those experiences are happening later and later. And based on that, we still have this feeling within us that we're still kind of kids, that we're like adult imposters. This imposter syndrome kind of plays in the back of our head. Like we're not quite ready. We're not, like I talked about in the past video, we're not quite ready to be an adult. We're not quite at that point. We haven't had the experiences that we need to. And so we still feel, despite maybe not being adolescents, we still feel like we are. We still feel like we're struggling with that same difficulty of maybe we've had our innocence removed. We've had that taken away from us because of how the world is, because of the negativity, because so many things in the news are just crazy today. But we haven't put the pieces fully back together. We haven't emerged from our story as fully realized adults yet. So more than it just being a story of a loss of trust in institutions, of difficulty, of finding a romantic partner, of having all this pent-up frustration at the world we live in and then directing it online. And that's part of the reason why we empathize with, why some of us at least, might empathize with what happened. More than even what we talked about in the last video, about personally feeling like we're not going to be prepared. We're not going to be prepared for what the world brings us and what we might have to deal with, and that there's always something lurking behind the scenes, some piece of being an adult, some fine print that might come out and take us out. But more than just that, the point of this final video is to show that a lot of the elements that played out in the events we're talking about, with the person we're talking about, actually resemble a lot of the same fiction, the same stories that we've encountered our entire lives, that we've grown up with, that we've aged into, these coming of age stories. There's so much of this overlap. Why? Because when you look at it, not only was the CEO the same age as most of our parents, but he ends up representing, for a lot of us, this kind of corruption of someone who happens to be our parents' age, who sits atop an organization that represents so many of the corrupt things to these people I'm talking about, to these members of Gen Z, and then finding someone, seeing someone our own age stand up to that and do something about it in a way that is against the law and is a crime 100%, but ends up still looking like, to at least some of us, a lot like the stories we've encountered. So that's been a look into how the narratives of our culture and the stories we've grown up with have poised a lot of Generation Z to be more supportive than others might expect. Thanks for looking into it, and I'll see you in the next one.